What I want to do actually first is kind of set the stage, because if people don't know like even where the country is or anything about it, then everything else I'm going to tell you in this episode is not going to make sense. So first of all, Guyana is in South America, all right? So it actually borders Venezuela, Brazil, Suriname, and Atlantic Ocean. So you have, which was British Guyana, then Suriname, and then French Guyana, okay? So 3 countries side by side in South America. However, it's not really a South American country, which is kind of random. Geographically, it is, but in reality, culturally, economically, it's a CARICOM country, okay? It's part of the Caribbean states. So that off the bat is very, very interesting. Now, it's the only English-speaking country physically located in South America. And I thought, well, this is very interesting because, there's not all that many English-speaking expat destinations that people would want to move to, okay? Obviously, the G8, the G7, a lot of these are English-speaking countries. And then maybe we have Belize in Central America, but most of the countries in English-speaking world are not really, expat hotspots, at least for freedom-minded people like us who are trying to get away from taxation. So that's the first very, very important piece. Now, Guyana has about 800,000 people as of 2025, and the capital is Georgetown. This is where I actually went, was to Georgetown itself. Now, they have their own currency, the Guyanese dollar, the GYD. Now, I was able to collect some of them for my currency collection. We try to take some bills of everywhere that we're going, but I was able to use credit card everywhere I was there, so it was very easy to get by. Now, it was a former colony. As I said before, it was British Guyana, slightly different spelling, but they actually got their independence in 1966 from the UK. And then in 1970, it became a republic. Now, the current administration they were the incumbent. So this is Mohammed Irfan Ali. He is the incumbent, and we actually went there at the exact same time as the election, because I am very interested in a lot of these things. So we were there for the election, for the recount, and it was very interesting. He won, and then the opposition demanded a recount. They did a recount, and I actually, when I was in the business class lounge flying back, I met an economist from the United States who was invited down to Guyana to be an observer for the election. And so we talked for, half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that, about the politics and the economics of the country. And I was like, he was explaining, he was specifically invited as an observer, as well as some colleagues and other people. And I was like, and how was it? He said, totally clean, no question about it. Definitely the person that they voted for, that they is the same gentleman who got in. So Irfan Ali, there was not, even the opposition couldn't really claim otherwise, which is not the case in some other countries like we saw in Brazil on the previous elections, and then some other stuff I won't mention in other countries.
In certain countries that I think we can say it now, but I'll still play it safe. That stuff doesn't get you as banned as it used to, but we'll still be safe. Certain countries that yes, I may or may not.
Certain large countries in the center of North America.
There you go.
I won't go any further.
May or may not have a former reality show as president. There we go. I think they'll figure it out.
Here's where it gets really interesting when trying to understand the country. Because it is a former British colony, the Brits are really good at / bad at, depending on, which side you're coming from, on country building, okay? So they brought in different ethnic groups to this country hundreds of years ago. So you're looking at the population around 40%, which are, call it Indo-Guyanese. So like Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, there's Hindi, there's Urdu, as languages and things like that. That's about 40% of the population. Then you have Afro-Guyanese, so like African slaves who came hundreds of years ago from the Dutch, because you have to understand this was a Dutch colony, and then there was a small war, and then the English took it over, and then they brought in other groups. Actually, another quick side note about the Dutch. The capital of Guyana is actually basically underwater. So it's below sea level, and the Dutch started building these seawalls. And I was like, of course the Dutch did. I mean, this is what they do. Like, why you couldn't just build on normal land? You need to try to reclaim land. And this was 500 years ago they were doing
Dutch showed
this.
up and just saw an awesome challenge.
Yeah, so it's like the tide goes out. It's like, I don't think the country should start here. I think the country should start over there. So they had to build seawalls. So now, I think it's 2.5, 3 meters basically under sea level, which is just so weird to see. And then they've replanted a lot of the mangroves and everything like that. So although it is a coastal nation, you can't actually see the water because you have this huge seawall and then mangroves that are like 5 meters high. And so you don't actually get sea views or anything like that. But anyways, the ocean is very dirty. It's not really dirt. Well, actually, I guess technically it is dirt because it is the rivers that are coming in and bringing in all that, leaves and debris and everything like that. So it's not like a Caribbean, turquoise water or anything like that. So it's this weird type of mix. Anyways, so we have the Afro-Guyanese, and then we have the indigenous Amerindians. That's about 10% of the population. And then we got about 20% more of the population, which is just a mixed bag. I think, we were meeting people and they're like, yeah, my father was Chinese and my mother was Hindi, but her parents were Muslims. And then I also have some black in there, some African. And it was like, everybody was kind of, and he's like, I'm Guyanese. And I was like, amazing. Okay. So, everybody is mixed together. But you're looking at a religion of like Christianity, Hindu, and Islam in this country. And then this shows up in so many different ways, like in the music, sometimes you'll see a church and then you'll see a mosque and then you'll see all these cultural things in the food. I think I mostly ate curry while I was there for 4 days. Was mostly curry every day, which I was not expecting at all.
Not what I typically associate with a Caribbean or a Caribbean country per se.
Yeah, it was, I'm trying to get my head around it while I'm there. And I'm expecting to go to a South American country. All right. That's what I had in my head. An English speaking South American country. And within like 10 minutes, I'm like, I'm not in South America. I'm in the Caribbean. But the religion. So we're looking at roughly about 57% of the population have a Christian background. Now that's broken down into different sects of Christianity. 23% are Hinduism, and then 7% are Islamic. And then you've got some indigenous and other types of beliefs that make up the remainder 13%. So to go back to our point about the British, they don't want a monoculture in their countries. They don't want, racial homogeny, all the same. They want lots of fighting factions because if there's a lot of infighting, then they're much easier to control. And this is definitely what we're seeing in this country. A lot of infighting between the different groups, and different political parties are different religions, different backgrounds, different ethnic divides, which really shows you why in 2025, even with all of these things going for them, the country is a bit of a mess, hinting at before.
I mean, my most interesting observation from that is that, what you're describing, that might be the British Empire's playbook for their colonies historically and countries that they try to control. But it actually seems that is their domestic playbook in the last 5 to 10 years, is to actually create that same internal division, which could lead to a whole bunch of tangents and questions that we're not going to tackle on this episode. But it is the first thing that came to mind when you described that.
Very astute, Mark, because that's exactly right. What they're doing in the UK, this is not new. They have honed this and they have practiced this around the world for hundreds of years, and now they're bringing it home. That is truly terrifying in reality.
Absolutely. And then we're certainly seeing it play out on the streets and in various forums in the UK. So that is a situation we've discussed before. And all we can say is we love our UK friends and we hope you'll come join us in greener pastures. I was wondering what it actually feels more like if it's sort of politically in the Caribbean. It is more of a Caribbean feeling country overall.
Through and through and through. And I think to actually drive there, okay, I think you can drive to the neighboring countries, but you can't really get to Brazil or the greater South America region, although I did hear that they are going to be building roadways to Brazil through the Amazon. Now, I was just in the Amazon a couple of weeks ago in Manaus, in the center of the Amazon in Brazil, and that is a city of 2 million people, which is basically an island in the middle. I say an island, it's not surrounded by water, it's surrounded by jungle on all sides. So I think it would be very interesting if they were to connect proper with Brazil and be able to get goods shipped up from Brazil, because as you will see in today's story, they do not have access to a lot of goods. Okay. Now, 85% of Guyana is rainforest. All right. So you basically have this little strip, a little bit inland, where they're producing a bit of their own food. But 85% is dense rainforest jungle. Now that's intense. Okay. Now, I actually had a chance to leave Georgetown, and we took a small airplane, a prop plane, to Kaieteur Falls, which was about an hour and 10 minutes flight. And it was specifically just to go and see these waterfalls. So we actually did like a couple of, passes of the waterfalls as we flew in. And it is the world's tallest single drop waterfall. So not a cascading waterfall where it's going down, single drop waterfall. And it was so tall that I couldn't even see the bottom. Now, if I had gotten right up to the edge, maybe I would have been able to see the bottom, but I like to stay a couple of feet back with 4 children and a wife and a mother that I support, as well as a, lead of team of roughly 30 people. I don't need to be going too close to the edges.
They have drones now for a reason. If you want to see that stuff, there are other methods.
Exactly. I'm like, I'm not taking a risk on this whatsoever. So I'm going to stay, 4 feet back or something, 5 feet back.
Is it that actually, can you actually get that close that you could theoretically just sort of spill over if you were not being careful?
100%. And it's, we went and saw the falls at 3 different vantage points. There's no railings. It's pretty, sandy and, gravelly to go up there, and you don't have the most sure footing. And I'm like, I'm not going to get so close to get a better picture. Like I like good pictures, but I like being alive a lot more. So for sure, I'm going to just kind of step back. So in all of the photos, and I'll put them out on our Instagram for Expat Money Show, I highly suggest you guys go and check them out. You'll see this huge waterfall, but you won't see the bottom. And that's the reason why, because it was just so tall and because I am very particular about staying alive. Okay, so economically, this country is very focused on a couple of things. So historically, it was like sugar, rice, gold, lots of mining and things like that. But today, it's oil. Oil dominates everything in this country. So they're doing roughly 660,000 barrels a day in 2025. Now, this has obviously created some tension with their neighbors of Venezuela. So obviously, everybody understands that there's an embargo with Venezuela. There's sanctions in place against the Maduro regime. I do not like the Maduro regime whatsoever. Really horrible, abusive there. But I don't know, Mark, did you ever see the movie There Will Be Blood? And it's about the Texas oil reserves going back, a couple hundred years. Yeah. So there's one point in the end of the movie where they start talking about selling the oil reserves. And this gentleman's been wanting to buy the oil reserves or buy the oil rights for decades. And he says, I will sell them to you, the richest ones. And he said, no, you don't understand. They're gone. I already drank them up. It's like a straw. Instead of going straight down, they went on an angle. And they started sucking up all the oil underneath someone else's reserves. It appears that is what is happening in Guyana and Venezuela. So they've discovered oil in Guyana.
You mean on the Guyana side they've discovered it, or?
Yes. But what they're saying is that it is like this, like on an angle going into Venezuela's. So instead of going straight down in the offshore rigs, they're going on an angle and they're sucking up, they're taking all the oil out of Venezuela, and Venezuela is pissed. Now, the U.S. is actually sending naval cruisers and things like that to defend against Venezuela because the U.S. is the buyer of this oil, so they want to get access to this.
So that might be a a little insider reason, or maybe not even that insider. You just had to read the headlines a little bit of why the U.S. is suddenly very interested in Maduro and his wrongdoings, which I think we both agree, not a good guy, not someone we really like to see in power. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're coming in as a white knight savior here per se.
Well, I had a chance to go and visit Kuwait. I want to see 18 years ago, something like that. And that's basically what happened in the first Gulf War. Was Kuwait was sucking up the oil of Iraq, and Iraq was pissed, and they invaded Kuwait. And then the U.S. stepped in and then wiped the floor with Iraq in record time. But this was the reason why, because they were sucking up the oil from the underneath their borders, underground.
So we've literally seen this before.
This is like part of the playbook.
To a T. Yeah.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
And so the U.S. steps in. So they found this oil in 2015. But you can imagine it's not like you find oil and then the next day you're super wealthy, right? Like you need time for Exxon to go in and to build the offshore oil rigs and all of these things and negotiate. So now the money is starting to flow in, but it hasn't started trickling down yet. And I definitely noticed this in my time there. This is the fastest growing GDP per capita in the world. They're getting somewhere around 40 to 45% annual GDP growth increase. That is nuts. Now, their PPP for GDP is somewhere around $94,000. That is huge for a small Caribbean country.